Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Lovely to have your company this morning. Now, I appreciate that all the time we're firing different polling figures at you and it gets quite confusing. So I thought we'd get a pollster in to unpick it all. Scarlett Maguire is the Director of JL Partners. Lovely to see you this morning, Scarlett. Do you know what I'm getting confused by, if I can be honest? OK, there's this MRP polling, which seems to be the most sort of cataclysmic for the Tories. All of these suggestions that Labour are going to have a supermajority and the Tories are going to be left to like Liberal Democrat numbers, 40 seats, one poller said this morning, I think. And then some polling that your good selves have carried out, which suggests that, well, at least last week before the D-Day thing, that Labour were only 12 points ahead of the Conservatives. So how do we work it all out?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that pollsters are trying to figure out at the moment as well. So you're right, there are lots of different polls saying lots of different things. I think the first thing to say is that some things are consistent. So the things that are consistent are, without wanting to sound too obvious, is a big Labour lead, and a big Labour lead that will translate into a Labour majority. I think most people now agree that looks like by far the most likely option on polling day. There are some other consistencies as well. So, for example, Reform, I think, definitely on average, and on most pollsters is on double figures. It wasn't, if we look back to autumn last year, it was struggling to even hit 5%. So we can see that Reform have risen in the polls. And again, the Lib Dems everywhere seem to be low double digits as well, around 10%. Now, there are some different things going on here. So if we take the first thing about different voting intention polls can have different methods. Now, you're right. We had a poll out a couple of weeks ago that showed a Labour 12-point lead. Ours is actually now back to a sort of 17 or 18-point lead again. And that's before D-Day. So we'll have another one coming out tomorrow.
Wow. So you've told people on D-Day. What were you expecting? Yes.
Well, I think, yeah, exactly. Without wanting to second guess what the data is going to say, we have seen some polls that have been in the field at least since Nigel Farage announced he was going to stand in Clacton, and some since D-Day, and most seem to show a rise in Reform's vote, and potentially and that will damage the Conservative Party. There's some speculation about whether that could hurt current Labour voters as well, whether they might go. So that's one thing. And then on the sort of final thing about MRPs, that's a great question. So MRPs have in recent elections been considered to be the sort of gold standard of polling. There have been a couple of fantastically accurate ones. They involve doing modelling. Now, using much bigger samples, so in a standard voting intention poll, we might ask 2,000 people. I saw the latest YouGov one last week, I think asked 60,000. So they're asking huge amounts of people. But then what they're doing is they're getting all that information from around the country. They're working out different things about each constituency and the demographics in that constituency, as well as sort of building a lot of assumptions and very educated guesses about voters and how they might behave. So then they have that massive pool of data. Then they can sort of infer or use all their clever models to work out what then might happen in each constituency. The thing is, those models are only as good as those very educated guesses. Now, as I was saying, they are very educated guesses, but in an election where there's so many question marks, especially over things like turnout and about how many don't knows might return back to the Conservative Party, for example, that's when you start seeing some quite different seat projections. Again, though, I think out of the most recent ones we've had, the best result for the Conservative Party, or at least I think the second best result, still has their worst defeat in 100 years. So whichever way you look at it, it's going to be bad.
It's not looking great. Can we talk about the Farage factor? He's made extraordinary gains for Reform in the last week since he announced his candidacy and leadership of the party. I mean, how well could Reform do? He was sitting in that seat last week when I was covering the 7 till 8 hour, saying that they would overtake the Tories. Could they?
I wouldn't rule it out at all. In fact, if anything, I think it's at least as likely they do as they don't in one or two polls. We've already had a couple of polls last week that put them just 2 points behind the Conservative Party, so they're getting quite close. And I think it's the sort of thing that could really build up momentum. At the moment, the Conservatives' best argument against a vote for Reform is that it is is a vote for the Labour Party because you're going to help whatever the second biggest party in that constituency is get in, be it the Labour or Lib Dems.
Are you seeing any evidence of Labour people coming across to Reform as well as Tories? Because this was something Farage said as well last week.
Yeah, I think it's too early to say. I think the first thing you can say is that in terms of 2019 Labour voters, I don't think there's much of a crossover. Now, that makes sense if you think about in 2019 it was Jeremy Corbyn that was on the ballot for Labour voters. So there's unlikely, I'm sure you'll find the odd quite idiosyncratic voter that voted for Jeremy Corbyn Melbourne now wants to vote for Nigel Farage, but there won't be great numbers of them. In terms of current Labour voters, it might well be that they take some. We actually did a hypothetical poll just a few weeks ago saying, you know, how would you vote if Nigel Farage returned as the leader of the Reform Party and standing as an MP? And we found at that point that he was taking votes from current Labour voters and current Conservative voters. But overall, it's still overwhelmingly damaging the Conservatives, and that's what will happen on election day.
Because also, even if they're old Labour voters, these are the voters that will have switched to the Tories in 2019, and therefore they are technically classed as Tories. They're Boris Johnson supporting former Labour voters, and therefore the vote comes from the Tories and not from Labour, if anyone's following that. I'm not even sure I am. Let's also talk about just this discrepancy. So explain this to us. And I know the first past the post system and proportional representation is slightly tricky to analyse on a Sunday morning when everyone's enjoying their breakfast. But let's try, because we have a situation where we've got Reform and the Lib Dems basically tracking each other. And yet, obviously, the Lib Dems are up for maybe 40 seats. We might wake up on July the 5th and think, how has that happened? And yet Reform are only predicted to win 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is how it works. So in our first past the post system, it's about who can come first in their particular constituency. The Liberal Democrats have a very, very, very efficient vote because it is not spread evenly around the country. So they are piling up votes in the constituencies that they are more likely to win. And they've been doing that for many, many years. And also, the Liberal Democrats, I think this election, the common wisdom is they are going to actually could hurt them in some constituencies as well in terms of their overall vote share. But they will be assisted by getting MPs by a drive for tactical voting to get the current government out. At least that's what we're seeing signs of already.
So you're saying that the vote share for Reform goes up, but they don't necessarily win the seat because they're not first. But then this is giving everybody reminders who can remember it of sort of 1983 and the SDP. Could we have a situation then where Reform obviously gets this extraordinary vote share? I'm just trying to analyse it from kind of a historic perspective. Could something, you know, historical happen in political science that suddenly the Tories... I mean, when's the last time the Tories have been pushed into third?
Well, that's a great point. We had, in the 2019 European elections, the Conservatives were pushed into fifth place, and that's partly what's triggered the last few years of this sort of drama that we've had in the Conservative Party. It's certainly what triggered Theresa May to resign. And they came behind Nigel Farage again, Farage's Brexit Party. So, I mean, you don't even have to go back as far to the 80s to look at a situation where a party can get millions of votes and not result in many MPs. UKIP got 3.5 million votes in 2015. They then sort of dropped off a map in 2017. But so, yeah, it's not unprecedented, and these things do happen. However, what I would say is that even though then that doesn't translate to representation in Parliament for those MPs, it can still be hugely influential. And so it can still decide a direction of a political party. There's lots of rumours about whether Conservative MPs, however many of them are left after the election, may be tempted to take in Nigel Farage if he does win Clacton. So the influence can be outsized compared to the MPs, is what I would say.
And also, before you go, can you just give us the latest in Scotland? We've seen over the course of recent weeks and months a sort of SNP implosion. That's going to be key critical to Labour, because let's be honest, it's going to be Labour picking up those seats and not necessarily the Tories or the Lib Dems, right? So what do we think might happen up north of the border?
Labour will be the main beneficiaries of what has been a very bad year for the SNP. So ever since Nicola Sturgeon stood down, they've seen a sort of steady decline in the polls. That got worse after Humza Yousaf's resignation. And we're now seeing consistently from different pollsters sort of the biggest Labour leads in Scotland since the 2014 independence referendum. That would be very significant for the election. It could be that Labour pick up as many as 20, 30 seats in Scotland. They're currently on 2.
But that could be make the difference. I mean, I don't think the polls are now suggesting sort of hung parliaments and no overall winner, but Scotland could kind of be the kingmaker here.
Scotland could certainly really help Keir Starmer, and I think that's a great point, because a few months ago when, or let's say this time last year, when there was a bit more speculation about how this might all go, whether Rishi Sunak could be able to close the gap in the polls, awful lot of attention on Scotland, because that was felt like that held the definite key to number 10. Now that we're looking at some of the seat projections that we talked about earlier, where you're looking at sort of Conservative wipeouts, it seems to me that people aren't paying quite enough attention to Scotland, because they're sort of thinking, well, a Labour majority is a given anyway. But it's fascinating, not just obviously for the voters in Scotland, but for what happens down in Westminster too.
Still got more than half of this campaign to go, though, haven't we?
I
know, Scarlett, should we seek help? Look, you've been brilliant in explaining this, because it is bamboozling, all of these different numbers coming in and sort of this idea of a Tory apocalypse. So thank you very much for sorting that all out for us this morning. Lovely to see you.